The summer of 1943 presented the German High Command with one last, desperate opportunity to regain the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. Following the crushing defeat at Stalingrad, the line of contact between the Wehrmacht and the Soviet Red Army had stabilized into a massive, awkward bulge, extending deep into German-held territory, centered around the city of Kursk. This geological anomaly, the Kursk salient, was a direct invitation for a massive, coordinated offensive, a natural target for a double envelopment maneuver designed to pinch off the salient, annihilate the massive Soviet forces trapped within, and permanently shorten the vast, resource-consuming Eastern Front. This operation, codenamed Operation Citadel, was Hitler's final, colossal gamble, a commitment of the vast majority of Germany's remaining armored reserves and its newest, most technologically sophisticated weapons. The German strategy was predicated on the overwhelming tactical superiority of their new armor. The assault was spearheaded by the formidable Tiger I heavy tank and the revolutionary Panther medium tank. These machines represented the pinnacle of German military engineering. The Tiger, with its thick armor and devastating 88mm gun, and the Panther, with its sloped armor and high-velocity 75mm cannon, were tactically superior to anything the Red Army possessed on a tank-for-tank basis. The German command believed that this technological edge, combined with the disciplined execution of the pincer movement, would guarantee a swift surgical breakthrough, paralyzing the Soviet command and restoring the momentum of the Blitzkrieg. The entire plan was a testament to the belief that technological superiority could compensate for the massive growing material and manpower disparity. However, the Soviet command, operating under the immense strategic control of Joseph Stalin and the superior intelligence of its espionage network, was fully aware of the German intentions. The element of surprise, the crucial precondition for any blitzkrieg maneuver, was utterly negated. The Soviet response was not a panicked scramble. It was a methodical, disciplined, and historically unprecedented construction of a vast, layered defensive system, a defense in depth that turned the entire Kursk salient into a massive, multi-layered anti-tank trap. This defensive masterpiece, extending for hundreds of kilometers, was composed of belts of dense minefields, thousands of anti-tank guns dug into fortified positions, extensive trench lines, and massive reserves positioned deep in the rear. The Soviet objective was clear and brutal: allow the German offensive to consume its limited fuel and irreplaceable armor against the prepared defenses, bleed the attacking force white, and then launch a massive, coordinated counterattack that would guarantee the total strategic loss of Germany's remaining operational reserves. The battle was poised not as a surprise attack, but as a direct, head-on collision between German technological superiority and Soviet material depth and tactical endurance. The stage was set for a brutal, grinding battle of attrition, a confrontation that would definitively prove whether the sophisticated quality of German engineering could overcome the sheer, unyielding volume of Soviet industrial output and human sacrifice. The German offensive, launched on July 5, 1943, immediately stalled against the immense initial layer of the Soviet defense in depth. The spearheads, despite the tactical superiority of their tanks, were slowed to an agonizing crawl by the dense minefields and the devastating coordinated fire of the Soviet anti-tank artillery. The immense continuous consumption of German armor and manpower in the initial breach attempts proved unsustainable. The southern arm of the pincer, led by the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, eventually succeeded in pushing through several defensive layers, but their advance was checked at the small, unassuming village of Prochorovka. It was here, in the open, rolling terrain, that the colossal, defining Battle of Kursk, and arguably the largest tank battle in history, would erupt. The Soviet command, realizing the immense danger posed by the advancing SS Panzer formations, immediately committed its vast reserve, the 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by General Pavel Rotmistrov, to a massive, localized counterattack designed to halt the German advance definitively. The Soviet plan was characterized by tactical audacity and a willingness to accept immense casualties. a head-on charge designed to negate the superior range and firepower of the German heavy tanks by engaging them at extremely close quarters. The Soviet T-34s and T-70s, though outclassed in armor and gun size, sought to swarm the German panzers, aiming to penetrate their thinner side and rear armor before the German guns could effectively engage them from a distance. The resulting collision on July 12 near Prokhorovka was a chaotic, unparalleled firestorm. Hundreds of tanks from both sides charged toward each other, turning the open fields into a massive, swirling maelstrom of smoke, fire, and shattering metal. The close-quarters engagement immediately undermined the primary advantage of the German heavy tanks, their long-range, high-velocity guns. In the close, confusing melee, the Soviet T-34s, utilizing their superior speed and maneuverability, closed the distance, turning the battle into a desperate, high-risk brawl. The battlefield quickly became so dense with fighting vehicles that the effectiveness of centralized command dissolved, forcing tank crews and platoon leaders to rely on individual instinct and courage. The carnage was immense. Tanks from both sides burned, their ammunition racks exploding with terrifying force, sending thick plumes of black smoke miles into the sky. The sheer number of Soviet tanks committed to the charge, estimates suggest over 800 Soviet tanks against approximately 400 German tanks, including the devastating Panthers and Tigers, created an overwhelming, localized wave of material power that the German forces, despite their tactical skill, could not entirely absorb. The Battle of Prokhorovka was not a clean, strategic victory for the Soviets. They suffered massive material losses, far exceeding the German casualties, but it achieved its singular, non-negotiable objective. The German spearhead was stopped. The Tetlad SS Panzer Corps was effectively checked, their momentum destroyed, and the strategic initiative was irrevocably seized by the Red Army. The final, brutal reality was that the German technological advantage was neutralized by the sheer, unyielding volume of Soviet material and human sacrifice. Attention, forward observers. You've just witnessed the largest tank collision in history, where audacious tactics met heavy German steel. The sheer, unyielding charge of the 5th Guards changed the game forever. If the decisive clash at Prokhorovka resonates with your understanding of the war's pivot points, then do not let this strategic memory fade. Subscribe now and commit to preserving the records of these critical breakthroughs. And here is your tactical query. Was the Soviet close-quarters charge more successful due to the T-34's maneuverability, or the sheer overwhelming mass of numbers committed to the attack? Drop your strategic assessment in the comments below. Let the historical debate define modern tank warfare. The immense sacrifice at Prokhorovka would have been strategically meaningless had it not been for the massive, coordinated effort that built the defense in depth, the true, silent victor of the battle. Of Kursk. The Soviet defensive network was a monumental feat of engineering and operational planning, transforming the entire Kursk salient into a series of multi-layered, synergistic anti-tank strongholds that systematically consumed the German offensive power long before the decisive tank clash. The construction of the defenses, executed over months with the immense commitment of both military engineers and hundreds of thousands of civilians, was historically unprecedented. The defensive system was composed of 7 distinct sequential lines that extended for more than 250 kilometers deep into the Soviet rear area. The initial layers were the most lethal, dense, patterned minefields that systematically stripped the German tanks of their mobility, forcing them into predictable lanes of advance. These minefields were immediately followed by massive networks of anti-tank ditches, designed to stall and trap the heavy German armor. The real strength of the defense lay in the meticulous integration of anti-tank artillery. Thousands of anti-tank guns and high-velocity field artillery pieces were dug into prepared, mutually supporting positions that covered every possible avenue of armored advance. These anti-tank boxes were designed to inflict maximum attrition on the German panzers as they struggled to traverse the minefields and ditches. The German High Command, expecting to fight infantry, encountered a defensive system specifically designed to defeat the very heavy armor they relied upon for breakthrough. The defense was not passive. It was a system designed for attrition, forcing the Germans to expend irreplaceable armor against fixed, concealed positions. The meticulous, layered defense guaranteed that the German offensive momentum was destroyed incrementally. Even when the German forces managed to breach the first 3 lines of defense, they encountered fresh, prepared defensive belts, manned by reserve armies. This ensured that the elite German units committed to the attack were constantly consuming their limited fuel, materiel, and operational energy in a relentless, agonizing series of frontal assaults. By the time the German spearhead reached Prokhorovka, they were already weakened, fatigued, and severely depleted of armor and logistical support. The defense in depth was the true strategic bridge that held firm against the blitzkrieg. It was a monument to Soviet industrial organization and operational foresight, confirming that superior intelligence and massed, prepared material could effectively neutralize the tactical and technological advantage of the German armor. The German defeat at Kursk was secured by the immense, static, unyielding quality of the Soviet defensive system, which systematically denied the Wehrmacht the speed and maneuverability necessary for a decisive breakthrough. The Battle of Kursk stands as the definitive, unassailable case study in the strategic logic of quality versus quantity, a logic that ultimately dictated the final outcome of the Eastern Front. The German offensive relied on the qualitative superiority of its new tanks. The Soviet defense relied on the quantitative, unyielding superiority of its industrial output and material reserves. The outcome confirmed that in a protracted war of attrition, mass and depth will invariably defeat localized technological quality. The German commitment to technological quality was exemplified by the Tiger and Panther tanks. These tanks were tactical marvels, possessing thicker armor, better optics, and superior guns than their Soviet counterparts, allowing them to engage and destroy Soviet T-34s from distances where the T-34's main gun was ineffective. The strategic planning was rooted in the belief that these superior machines, deployed en masse, would guarantee the necessary breakthrough. However, this qualitative advantage came at a profound cost: complexity, limited production capacity, and reliance on specialized logistics. The new German tanks were difficult to manufacture, required immense resources, and were prone to mechanical breakdown in the harsh operating conditions. The Soviet commitment to quantitative superiority was defined by the T-34 and the industrial machine that produced it. The T-34, while tactically inferior in terms of armor and gun range to the new German heavy tanks, was simple, rugged, and, most critically, designed for mass production. Soviet factories, relocated deep into the Urals and Siberia, churned out T-34s at a rate that dwarfed German production, ensuring that the Soviet losses at Prokhorovka were rapidly and continuously replaced. The Soviet strategic logic was to accept heavy losses in material and human life, knowing that their industrial base could sustain the attrition while the German forces were expending irreplaceable, finite resources. The Battle of Kursk demonstrated the catastrophic strategic failure of the German qualitative approach. The immense losses of Tigers and Panthers, coupled with the systemic mechanical breakdowns, consumed the last operational reserves of the Wehrmacht and effectively guaranteed that the German armored divisions would never again operate at full strength. The Soviet forces, despite suffering massive material losses in the initial defense and the counterattack, were able to absorb the shock and immediately transition to a sustained counteroffensive, a feat made possible by the continuous influx of materiel from their factories. The ultimate strategic verdict of Kursk was clear: technological superiority is meaningless if the military system cannot sustain the losses and replace the materiel rapidly. The Soviet quantitative advantage, rooted in a massive, resilient industrial base and a superior logistical system, was the decisive strategic weapon that guaranteed the terminal collapse of the German military effort on the Eastern Front. The tank quality debate was settled by the overwhelming volume of Soviet industrial output. The massive, sustained Soviet offensive launched after the check at Prokhorovka was not merely a military endeavor. It was a profound logistical pivot that leveraged the full capacity of the Soviet war machine, securing the necessary flow of fuel, ammunition, and men required to sustain the counteroffensive across vast distances. The success of the Red Army was inextricably linked to the resilience and sheer organizational genius of the Soviet supply system. The primary logistical success was the capacity to fuel the counteroffensive. The German blitzkrieg had failed due to fuel shortages. The Soviet counterattack succeeded because the logistical planners ensured that the massive tank armies and motorized infantry formations received the necessary petroleum to sustain the relentless pursuit. The Soviet supply network utilized a combination of rail transport, the rapidly restored Iron Road, truck convoys, and often the brutal improvisation of utilizing horse-drawn and even human transport over the damaged terrain. The ability to coordinate and sustain this massive logistical commitment across the vast, recaptured territory was a feat of organizational dominance. The rapid mobilization and deployment of massive manpower reserves was equally crucial. The Soviet command did not merely replace the losses, it committed entire fresh armies, sustained by the continuous influx of newly trained soldiers, to the counteroffensive. This immense manpower superiority ensured that the Soviet forces could maintain the tactical pressure on the retreating German lines, forcing them into a continuous series of costly rearguard actions and denying them the time necessary to establish a cohesive, static defense. The human reserve was the ultimate strategic weapon that guaranteed the continuous, relentless momentum of the Soviet advance. The strategic consequences of this logistical pivot were terminal for the German war effort. The German High Command, already suffering from the loss of its operational reserves at Kursk, was now forced into a continuous, costly retreat across the vast Eastern Front, a logistical nightmare that further consumed their remaining fuel, vehicles, and manpower. The German military machine was caught in an irreversible death spiral, forced to fight a war of movement that its shattered logistical system could no longer sustain. The massive Soviet counteroffensive, fueled by superior logistics and continuous industrial output, was the definitive strategic act that sealed the fate of the German military in the East. The check at Prokhorovka was a tactical moment. The sustained, relentless counterattack that followed was the strategic execution of the superior Soviet logistical paradigm. The vast industrial capacity and the unyielding commitment to sustain the counteroffensive across the immense Eastern Front were the final, unassailable strategic weapons that guaranteed the total annihilation of the German military effort. Seinen, Final Command Report. You've witnessed the decisive strategic shift where logistics secured the victory that quality could not. The Soviet counteroffensive was a triumph of system and supply. If the sheer scale of the Soviet logistical pivot resonates with your strategic mind, do not let this critical intelligence be lost. Subscribe now and commit to preserving the analysis of these monumental strategic shifts. And here is your final intelligence task. Suggest the next great logistical pivot of Weitu, the strategic shift that fundamentally altered the course of a major campaign. For our deep dive analysis, your suggestions guide our strategic mission. The monumental victory achieved by the Red Army at Kursk and in the subsequent counteroffensives came at a catastrophic and often overlooked scar of attrition, the immense, often staggering human and material cost sustained by the Soviet forces. While the strategic outcome was successful, the price paid by the Soviet military and the nation remains one of the most sobering and tragic statistics of the entire Second World War. The human cost was immense. The Soviet forces suffered far higher casualty rates than the German Wehrmacht during the Battle of Kursk, a direct consequence of the tactical doctrine that favored mass and close-quarters engagement to neutralize the German technological advantage. The immense loss of life, the millions of casualties sustained in the defense and the subsequent pursuit, was a profound national tragedy that demonstrated the ruthless, uncompromising nature of the total war state. The Soviet command, operating under the immense pressure of securing the nation's survival, was forced to accept catastrophic losses, knowing that their massive population reserve was the ultimate strategic resource. The material cost was equally staggering. The Red Army suffered immense losses of tanks and heavy equipment during the counterattack at Prokhorovka, and in the subsequent pursuit. The Soviet strategy, which accepted a higher rate of tank attrition, relied entirely on the continuous output of the industrial machine to replace these losses rapidly. This immense expenditure of material, while tactically successful, placed an immense strain on the Soviet industrial base, which was still in the process of recovery and expansion following the strategic relocations of 1941. The scars of attrition were borne by the continuous consumption of human and material resources. The German army, having failed to break the Soviet will, was now systematically broken by the massive sustained losses inflicted by the Soviet counteroffensive. The Red Army, fueled by immense courage and material superiority, pursued the German forces relentlessly, ensuring that the German military machine was consumed by a terminal war of attrition. The immense cost of the victory confirmed the brutal strategic reality of the Eastern Front. The war was won by the army that could absorb the greatest losses and sustain the continuous pressure on the enemy. The legacy of the scars of attrition remains a testament to the immense sacrifice required to secure the victory. The cost was immense, but the strategic payoff was total. The German military machine was definitively defeated in the East, relegating the Wehrmacht to a terminal war of defense and retreat that would only end with the final collapse. The long, grinding retreat of the German Wehrmacht across the Eastern Front was dictated by the unyielding operational tempo of the Soviet counteroffensives, a relentless, continuous application of military pressure that denied the German forces the time necessary to regroup, reorganize, or establish a cohesive, static defense. This sustained, high-intensity operational tempo was the ultimate strategic execution of the Soviet numerical and logistical superiority. The Soviet strategy was simple and brutal: maintain the momentum at all costs. The Soviet command understood that the immense logistical challenges of the Eastern Front, which had crippled the German advance, were equally challenging for the Soviet pursuit. However, by maintaining continuous, high-intensity pressure on the retreating German lines, the Soviets amplified the logistical failures of the Wehrmacht, forcing them to abandon heavy equipment and execute costly, disorganized tactical retreats. The pursuit was a relentless, strategic effort to deny the German forces the time necessary to establish a cohesive, static defensive line. The sustained operational tempo was underpinned by the superior Soviet logistical system. The rapid repair of the Iron Road, the continuous deployment of fresh reserves, and the steady influx of new materiel ensured that the Soviet frontline armies were constantly resupplied and maintained their operational capacity. This allowed the Soviet forces to execute massive, deep penetration maneuvers and coordinated offensives that kept the German forces in a continuous state of retreat and disarray. The German army, already suffering from massive losses, was now facing an opponent that was structurally capable of sustaining the continuous pressure. The German response was characterized by disorganization and mass loss of materiel. The German High Command, still paralyzed by Hitler's no-retreat orders and the constant interference from Berlin, was unable to execute a coherent, strategically sound withdrawal. The German forces were forced to abandon massive amounts of heavy equipment, consume their limited fuel reserves in disorganized retreats, and fight a continuous series of costly rearguard actions that further depleted their irreplaceable manpower. The unyielding pressure of the Soviet operational tempo guaranteed that the German retreat was neither efficient nor sustainable. The strategic consequence of this sustained pressure was the total consumption of the German fighting force in the East. The relentless, continuous counteroffensives ensured that the German military machine was systematically broken, its manpower decimated, and its ability to mount any future large-scale offensive operations permanently destroyed. The Soviet unyielding operational tempo was the ultimate execution of their strategic superiority, transforming the Eastern Front into a terminal war of attrition that could only end in total collapse. The unyielding operational tempo of the Soviet counteroffensives was immensely aided by the crucial partisan collaboration, the systematic, coordinated efforts of the Soviet resistance movement operating behind the German lines. The partisans, having created a devastating second front on the German rail lines, played a decisive role in further paralyzing the German logistical response and guaranteeing the success of the major Soviet offensives. The core of the partisan collaboration was the synchronized sabotage of the rail network. The Soviet command, fully aware of the German military's dependence on the rail lines for bulk supply, coordinated the major Red Army offensives with massive synchronized partisan attacks on the German converted rail lines. This ensured that the German forces, already struggling to sustain their operational capacity, were further crippled by the complete disruption of their vital supply arteries. Every train derailed, every bridge blown, and every rail station attacked by the partisans translated directly into critical shortages of fuel, ammunition, and food for the German frontline units. The strategic effect of the partisan collaboration was the amplification of German logistical paralysis. The immense scale of the rail sabotage forced the German High Command to divert massive numbers of combat troops from the front lines to purely logistical security roles, guarding the vulnerable rail network against the constant partisan threat. This consumed irreplaceable German manpower and further crippled the German capacity for mobile warfare. The Soviet strategy was simple: use the internal resistance to consume the German forces from within, further compounding the immense manpower losses suffered on the front lines. The nature of the partisan collaboration was characterized by ruthless efficiency and immense civilian sacrifice. The Soviet command provided the partisan groups with supplies, intelligence, and coordination, ensuring that their actions were strategically aligned with the major Red Army offensives. The German response, characterized by massive-scale reprisals against the civilian population, was strategically counterproductive, further solidifying local civilian support for the partisan cause. The terror and brutality of the partisan war were extreme, but their strategic efficacy in paralyzing the German logistical response was undeniable. The legacy of the partisan collaboration remains a testament to the Soviet strategy of total war and the utilization of every available resource. The successful coordination of the partisan efforts with the major Soviet offensives ensured that the German retreat was neither sustainable nor strategically sound. The partisans, fighting their brutal war in the swamps and forests, were the invisible, decisive force that guaranteed the success of the Soviet counteroffensives and the final total annihilation of the German military effort in the East. The immense strategic victory achieved by the Soviet forces on the Eastern Front was dictated by the unyielding will of its command, primarily Joseph Stalin, who faced a profound and ruthless commander's dilemma: the necessary, systematic prioritization of strategic victory over the immense, immediate cost in human life. The strategy of the Soviet counteroffensive was characterized by its immense scale, its disregard for conventional casualty rates, and its absolute focus on the total destruction of the German military machine, regardless of the price. Stalin's strategic imperative was simple: save the nation at all costs. The immense human losses suffered by the Red Army were viewed as a necessary, brutal cost for the survival of the Soviet Union. The Soviet command, operating under the centralized, ruthless efficiency of the total war state, was willing to absorb catastrophic losses, knowing that their massive population reserve was the ultimate strategic resource that guaranteed the continuous pressure on the German forces. This ruthless strategic calculus was the defining moral and operational factor of the Soviet counteroffensive. The commanders on the front lines, operating under the intense pressure of Stalin's directives, were often forced to execute high-risk, high-cost maneuvers designed to maintain the momentum and deny the German forces the time necessary to establish a cohesive defense. The counterattack at Prokhorovka, a tactical moment defined by the immense, high-cost charge of the 5th Guards Tank Army, was a direct execution of this strategic imperative: maintain the momentum at all costs, even if it meant absorbing massive, immediate losses. The Soviet command was operating under the assumption that their material and manpower reserves were functionally infinite, a strategic reality that the German High Command had fatally failed to anticipate. The dilemma was the ultimate strategic challenge: how to achieve total victory against a highly professional, well-armed adversary without consuming the very nation being saved. The Soviet answer was the relentless, continuous application of overwhelming force, sustained by the superior logistics and the unwavering political will of the centralized command. The immense human cost of this strategy was undeniable, but its strategic efficacy in breaking the German military's capacity for attrition was total. The legacy of the commander's dilemma remains a testament to the immense, necessary ruthlessness required to win a war of total attrition against a determined, fanatical adversary. The strategic victory achieved by the Soviet forces was secured by the immense sacrifice of its soldiers, a cost that was deemed necessary and ultimately paid by the command structure committed to the total destruction of the German military machine. The war was won by the unwavering will of the Soviet command, fueled by the logistics and the unassailable commitment to total victory. The long, brutal saga of the Eastern Front, defined by the strategic check at Kursk and the subsequent relentless Soviet counteroffensives, delivered the final, unassailable strategic verdict on the German military effort: strategic annihilation. The immense continuous consumption of German manpower and materiel, rooted in the logistical failures of the Blitzkrieg and the overwhelming material superiority of the Soviet war machine, guaranteed the total destruction of the German fighting force in the East. The verdict was confirmed by the terminal loss of German operational capacity. The massive, irreversible losses of armored reserves at Kursk, coupled with the immense manpower consumption in the subsequent retreat, ensured that the German military would never again operate at full strength. The Wehrmacht was relegated to a continuous grinding war of defense and retreat, unable to sustain the operational requirements of the vast Eastern Front. The strategic bridge was broken, and the German military was consumed by a terminal war of attrition. The strategic annihilation was executed by the superior Soviet logistical and industrial paradigm. The Soviet capacity to mobilize, supply, and sustain massive armies, coupled with the continuous output of the industrial machine, ensured that the immense losses of the early war were quickly and continuously replaced. The German forces, already suffering from irreplaceable losses, were now facing an opponent whose strength was rapidly growing, fueled by an inexhaustible supply of men and materiel. The war was lost in the factories and the supply depots, long before the final battles for Berlin. The final legacy of the Eastern Front is a testament to the immense necessary cost of achieving strategic annihilation. The total defeat of the German military machine was secured by the immense sacrifice of the Soviet soldier, the unyielding will of its command, and the overwhelming logistical superiority that transformed the vast Russian landscape into a logistical asset. The war was won by the sustained, relentless application of overwhelming force, ensuring that the German strategic ambition was entirely consumed by the unforgiving reality of total war. The logistical and environmental paralysis that crippled the German Wehrmacht in the winter of 1941 provided the Soviet Union with the critical window necessary to launch its triumphant counteroffensive, marking the definitive turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. This counterattack was not merely a reaction to German weakness, it was a testament to the immense, systematic mobilization of the Soviet war machine, a mobilization that exploited every strategic advantage that the brutal Russian environment and the centralized command structure provided. The primary strategic advantage of the Soviet counteroffensive was its logistical resilience and preparation for the winter environment. Unlike the German forces, the Soviet army was equipped with adequate winter gear, relying on skis, horse-drawn sleds, and specialized vehicles designed to operate effectively in the deep snow and extreme cold. This superior preparation provided the Soviet forces with the critical mobility that the German army had fatally lost, allowing them to execute swift, deep penetration maneuvers that cut off and encircled the frozen, static German positions. The mobility of the Soviet army was the direct, decisive counter to the paralysis of the Wehrmacht. The counteroffensive was also defined by the massive, centralized mobilization of Soviet manpower and industry. The Soviet command, operating under the ruthless efficiency of a total war economy, was able to mobilize massive reserves of fresh, newly trained soldiers and commit entire newly formed armies to the counterattack. Furthermore, The systematic relocation of Soviet industry deep into the Urals and Siberia ensured that the factories continued to churn out vast quantities of tanks, artillery, and aircraft, providing the material superiority necessary to sustain the prolonged counteroffensive. The German military machine, already crippled by irreplaceable losses, was now facing an opponent whose strength was rapidly growing, fueled by an inexhaustible supply of men and materiel. The tactical execution of the Soviet counteroffensive was characterized by its ruthless exploitation of the German immobility. The Soviet forces focused their attacks on the weakest points of the German line, often bypassing the static, heavily fortified German positions and striking deep into the logistical rear area. This forced the German High Command to abandon massive amounts of heavy equipment and execute costly, disorganized tactical retreats, further compounding the losses of materiel and operational capacity. The immense suffering and cost of the Soviet counteroffensive were undeniable, but its strategic effect in breaking the German operational capability was total and irreversible. The successful Soviet counteroffensive of 1941 was the moment the strategic initiative was irrevocably seized on the Eastern Front. It proved that the German blitzkrieg was not invincible, and that the immense logistical and environmental challenges of the Russian interior were the ultimate unassailable defense. The German army was relegated to a long, grinding war of defense and retreat, a fate that was sealed by the logistical failure of the summer and the mobilization of the superior, prepared Soviet war machine. The immense success of the Soviet counteroffensives was fundamentally dependent on the massive, heroic effort to rebuild and restore the shattered rail network, the Iron Road, that served as the absolute lifeline for the Soviet war machine. Just as the destruction of the rail lines was the strategic weapon of the Soviet retreat, the reconstruction of those lines was the strategic prerequisite for the massive, continuous counterattack. The effort to rebuild the infrastructure, often executed under continuous German air attack and in the brutal cold, represents one of the most phenomenal logistical achievements of the entire war. The challenge of rebuilding the rail network was monumental. The retreating Soviet forces had systematically destroyed every major bridge, rail station, and junction, often utilizing highly sophisticated demolition techniques to maximize the long-term damage. The German occupation and the continuous partisan warfare further complicated the effort, ensuring that every mile of rail line was a potential target for sabotage and attack. The Soviet railway troops and civilian workers, often operating with minimal heavy equipment and facing immense material shortages, were tasked with the impossible, repairing hundreds of miles of track, replacing massive steel bridges, and restoring the functionality of entire rail hubs, all while supporting the massive operational demands of the advancing armies. The restoration effort was defined by its speed and ingenuity. Soviet engineers quickly mastered the art of building temporary, low-cost wooden bridges and utilizing specialized track-laying machines to rapidly replace the destroyed sections of rail line. Crucially, the Soviet workers were able to rapidly reverse the German conversion of the rail gauge back to the wider Soviet standard, a vital process that allowed the massive Soviet-built locomotives and rolling stock to transport the bulk supplies necessary for the counteroffensive. The dedication of the railway workers, often working 18-hour shifts in sub-zero temperatures, was a profound testament to the civilian commitment to the war effort. The restored rail network became the engine of the Soviet counteroffensive. It allowed the rapid transport of massive amounts of supplies, ammunition, and replacement tanks and artillery, ensuring that the Soviet frontline armies were constantly resupplied and maintained their operational capacity. Furthermore, the rail lines were used to rapidly transport fresh Soviet reserves to the front, exploiting the German immobility and guaranteeing the continuous pressure on the collapsing German lines. The Iron Road was the strategic foundation that sustained the massive, continuous counterattack that defined the subsequent years of the Eastern Front. The immense effort to rebuild the Soviet rail network confirmed the fundamental principle of logistics. Infrastructure is the foundation of strategic mobility. The Soviet command, having successfully used its geography and infrastructure for denial, now used its immense organizational capacity to restore that infrastructure, transforming the Russian landscape from a logistical obstacle into a strategic asset that fueled the final, total annihilation of the German military effort in the East. Attention, General Staff! You've witnessed the monumental effort to rebuild the Iron Road, the true engine of the Soviet counteroffensive. The restoration of infrastructure was the victory. If the engineering and logistical brilliance of the Soviet war machine resonates with your strategic mind, then do not let this critical intelligence lapse. Subscribe now and commit to analyzing the logistics that truly win wars. And here is your operational query. Was the greatest logistical hurdle the reconstruction of destroyed bridges or the continuous partisan sabotage of the restored lines? Drop your strategic assessment in the comments below. Let the world hear the sound of the logistical analysis. The sustained success of the Soviet counteroffensives was underpinned by the massive, centralized tank production miracle that guaranteed the Soviet Army's material superiority on the Eastern Front. The Soviet main battle tank, the T-34, became the defining symbol of this industrial dominance, a weapon that combined superior design with an unparalleled capacity for mass production, providing the Soviet forces with the necessary material edge to sustain the long war of attrition. The T-34 was a masterpiece of pragmatic wartime engineering. Its sloped armor provided superior protection against German anti-tank fire, and its powerful engine and wide tracks gave it superior mobility over the difficult Russian terrain, particularly during the Rasputitsa and the deep snow of winter. Crucially, the T-34 was designed for mass production and simplicity. Its components were standardized, its construction was simplified, and its design allowed for massive-scale production with semi-skilled labor and minimal reliance on specialized machinery, a strategic decision that guaranteed the continuous supply of tanks to the front line, despite the immense material losses of the early war. The relocation of Soviet industry deep into the Urals and Siberia was the critical precondition for this production miracle. Entire factories, rail lines, and thousands of workers were systematically moved eastward, beyond the reach of German air attack, where they were rapidly reconstructed and immediately began producing tanks, artillery, and aircraft at an unprecedented rate. This centralized, coordinated industrial effort ensured that the immense losses of tanks suffered by the Soviet Army during the early devastating German advance were quickly and continuously replaced. The German military machine, already crippled by irreplaceable losses, was now facing an opponent whose strength was rapidly growing, fueled by an inexhaustible supply of men and materiel. The T-34's sheer numerical superiority became the decisive factor in the tank battles of the Eastern Front, including the massive clash at Kursk. While the German Panther and Tiger tanks were technologically superior in terms of armor and gunpowder, their complexity and resource demands meant that they could only be produced in limited numbers. The Soviet command, conversely, could simply overwhelm the superior German tanks with a mass of T-34s, a material strategy that guaranteed that the total strategic loss was always on the German side. The German High Command, despite their best efforts to introduce new, sophisticated designs, was constantly fighting a losing war against the sheer volume of Soviet production. The tank production miracle confirmed the ultimate truth of the Eastern Front. The war was won in the factories. The Soviet capacity to produce massive numbers of rugged, effective, and easily repairable tanks provided the material foundation for the continuous counteroffensives that defined the final years of the war. The T-34 became the physical manifestation of the superior Soviet logistical and industrial capacity, a weapon that conquered not through technological elegance, but through overwhelming, relentless numbers. The immense success of the Soviet counteroffensives was sustained by the profound endurance and resilience of the Red Army soldier, a factor that transcended mere material superiority and logistical capability. The sheer willingness of the Soviet fighting man to absorb catastrophic losses, fight under brutal conditions, and continue the advance against a well-armed and often fanatical opponent was the final, unassailable human resource that guaranteed the victory on the Eastern Front. The Soviet soldier was fighting for the survival of the nation itself. The initial devastating German advance inflicted catastrophic losses on the Red Army, often leading to massive encirclements and the annihilation of entire armies. Yet, the Soviet command, operating under the centralized ruthless efficiency of the total war state, was able to mobilize and commit massive reserves of manpower to the front line, constantly replenishing the immense losses and sustaining the operational pressure on the German forces. This inexhaustible supply of manpower, drawn from the vast population reserves of the Soviet Union, was a strategic resource that the German military could not possibly match. The morale and endurance of the Soviet soldier were sustained by a profound sense of patriotic and ideological commitment. The war was viewed as a life-or-death struggle for the survival of the homeland, the Great Patriotic War, a powerful narrative that motivated the Soviet soldier to fight with immense courage and tenacity, often in conditions that would have demoralized any other army. The brutality of the German occupation and the atrocities committed against the civilian population further fueled the Soviet soldiers' resolve, ensuring that the fight was not merely for territory, but for ultimate revenge and the total annihilation of the invader. The Red Army's ability to fight and survive in the brutal conditions of the Russian winter, a condition that crippled the German Wehrmacht, was a profound testament to the soldiers' endurance and the superior logistical preparation for the environment. The Soviet soldier, equipped with adequate winter gear and trained to utilize the environment for offensive maneuvers, proved capable of executing sustained operations in the extreme cold, an operational advantage that repeatedly exploited the German immobility and logistical paralysis. The immense sacrifice of the Red Army soldier, the millions of lives lost, the immense suffering, and the total commitment to the war effort was the ultimate human cost of the victory on the Eastern Front. The Soviet command's willingness to absorb immense losses and continue the pressure was a strategy dictated by the necessity of total war, a strategy that ultimately broke the German military's capacity for attrition. The Red Army's endurance, sustained by the logistical superiority of the Soviet war machine, was the final, unassailable human factor that guaranteed the total annihilation of the German military effort in the East. The defining saga of the Eastern Front, from the gates of Moscow to the final capture of Berlin, yielded a series of profound strategic lessons that reshaped modern military doctrine, confirming the decisive role of logistics, time, and space in large-scale conflict. The German failure and the Soviet triumph provided the ultimate brutal proof that strategic ambition must be judged against the unyielding laws of attrition and material capacity. The first and most enduring lesson was the primacy of space and time. The sheer vastness of the Soviet Union, coupled with the early logistical failures of the Blitzkrieg, guaranteed the Soviet command the critical time necessary to mobilize its massive industrial and human resources. The German failure to seize the decisive strategic objectives before the onset of winter provided the Soviet Union with the strategic space necessary to absorb the initial shock, relocate its industry, and organize a sustainable counteroffensive. The vast Russian landscape became the ultimate defense. The second lesson was the irreversibility of attrition. The immense continuous losses of men and materiel suffered by the German Wehrmacht, particularly at Stalingrad and Kursk, were functionally irreplaceable due to the logistical and industrial constraints of the German economy. The Soviet military, conversely, was able to sustain and even increase its operational strength through continuous mobilization and industrial output. The war became an irreversible process of attrition, a numbers game that the German military, despite its tactical skill, was mathematically destined to lose against the superior material capacity of its opponent. The third lesson was the non-negotiable role of infrastructure. The logistical collapse of the Wehrmacht, rooted in the destruction of the rail lines and the underestimation of the Rasputitsa and Winter, confirmed that infrastructure is the foundation of strategic mobility. The German military machine, unable to move, sustain, and resupply itself across the vast distances, was defeated by the logistical vacuum itself. The Soviet effort to restore the Iron Road and sustain its industrial output confirmed that infrastructure is the ultimate strategic asset in large-scale continental warfare. The final, lasting lesson of the Eastern Front was the total commitment to defense. The Soviet Union's willingness to absorb catastrophic losses, execute the scorched earth strategy, and commit its entire population and industry to the war effort was the ultimate human factor that guaranteed the victory. This commitment, sustained by a powerful ideological and patriotic narrative, transformed the conflict into a total, existential struggle that the German military was ill-prepared to match. The German strategic bridge was broken, and the entire Eastern Front became the definitive proof that modern warfare is ultimately determined by the overwhelming supremacy of logistics and material resources. The irreversible shift in strategic initiative following the Battle of Kursk meant that the German Wehrmacht was permanently consigned to a defensive war, culminating in the desperate, final effort to hold the Western Allies along the Siegfried Line, known to the Germans as the West Wall. This massive, static defensive network, stretching along the western border of Germany, was intended to be the final, impregnable shield that would buy the time necessary to fight the decisive battles in the East. However, just like the logistical failure on the Eastern Front, the defense of the Siegfried Line was fundamentally compromised by irreversible material and manpower deficiencies, guaranteeing its eventual collapse. The Siegfried Line was a vast, layered complex of bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, known as Dragon's Teeth, pillboxes, and command posts, designed to withstand sustained assault. Yet by late 1944 and early 1945, the line was critically undermanned and under-equipped. The massive attrition suffered on the Eastern Front, coupled with the commitment of Germany's operational reserves to the ill-fated Battle of the Bulge, meant that the defenses were often manned by ill-trained Volksgrenadier divisions, elderly Volkssturm troops, and scattered remnants of veteran units. The immense firepower and concentrated defense that the line required were simply non-existent. The tactical approach of the Western Allies, utilizing the massive logistical superiority secured by the opening of the port of Antwerp and the eventual crossing of the Rhine at Remagen, guaranteed the line's defeat. The Allies did not rely solely on frontal infantry assault. They utilized overwhelming artillery and air power to systematically dismantle the defenses before the infantry advanced. The constant bombing and concentrated shelling methodically destroyed the concrete emplacements, cut communication lines, and pulverized the German defensive positions, ensuring that the infantry's final assault was launched against a demoralized, shattered defense. The failure of the Siegfried Line was not a failure of its engineering. It was a failure of the industrial and manpower base necessary to sustain it. The German High Command could no longer provide the necessary trained soldiers, replacement tanks, or ammunition required to hold the static line against the relentless, overwhelming pressure of the Allied armies. The line, designed to be the final barrier, became a costly logistical sieve, consuming the last operational reserves of the German military machine. The collapse of the Siegfried Line was the strategic precondition for the final invasion of the German heartland. The line, meant to be the unbreakable bridge, yielded to the sustained, systematic application of Allied material superiority. The German defense, unable to sustain the losses, was forced into a terminal retreat, confirming that the defensive capabilities of even the most massive static fortifications are ultimately subordinate to the overwhelming logistical and industrial capacity of a determined adversary. The terminal collapse of the German military's professional fighting force led to the desperate, tragic mobilization of the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, an act of strategic delusion that committed elderly men and young boys to the defense of the fatherland against the overwhelming Allied armies. The rise of the Volkssturm was the clearest, most heartbreaking symbol of the profound manpower crisis and the ethical decay of the collapsing Nazi regime. The Volkssturm was composed of men deemed unfit for regular military service, those too old, too young, or previously exempted due to essential civilian occupations. They were hastily organized, poorly trained, and minimally equipped, often armed with obsolete rifles, Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, and possessing little more than rudimentary military discipline. Their commitment to the defense of the Reich, often fueled by fanaticism and terror, was pitted against the massive, professional, battle-hardened armies of the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, a confrontation that guaranteed catastrophic, meaningless casualties. The strategic failure of the Volkssturm was absolute. While individual units occasionally displayed immense courage and localized resistance, their lack of training, leadership, and heavy equipment meant that they were functionally incapable of mounting a sustained defense against the combined arms assault of the Allied forces. They were often used as static garrisons or thrown into frontal assaults against superior forces, becoming little more than disposable human shields that temporarily slowed the Allied advance at the cost of immense, immediate casualties. Their deployment was a profound act of strategic desperation, revealing the moral bankruptcy of a regime willing to sacrifice its entire male population to prolong a war already lost. The logistical implications of the Volkssturm were also disastrous. The commitment of these untrained, ill-equipped men to the front lines consumed scarce resources, including food, ammunition, and transport, that could have been used to support the remaining professional military units. The lack of operational cohesion created further chaos in the German defensive planning, guaranteeing that the final battles for the German heartland were fought in a state of disorganized, desperate confusion. The tragic narrative of the Volkssturm represents the final agonizing cost of the strategic failures of the German High Command. The men who should have been rebuilding the nation, or simply surviving the final collapse, were instead committed to a futile suicidal defense against an enemy they were entirely incapable of defeating. The deployment of the People's Militia was the ultimate proof that the German military effort had consumed its operational capacity and was resorting to desperate, unethical measures that only amplified the tragedy of total defeat. The legacy of the Volkssturm is a somber monument to the immense human cost of delusion and strategic collapse. The successful breaching of the Siegfried Line and the decisive crossing of the Rhine marked the beginning of the final race for Berlin, a military pursuit that saw the Allied armies, now fueled by the logistical abundance of Antwerp and the Remagen crossing, accelerate deep into the German heartland. This final phase of the war was defined by the relentless speed of the Western advance and the simultaneous catastrophic collapse of the German Eastern Front under the overwhelming offensive of the Soviet Red Army. The Allied advance in the West was characterized by mobile warfare and encirclement, utilizing the immense superiority in fuel, armor, and air power that had been secured by the logistical breakthroughs of 1944. The German military resistance, shattered by the Ruhr Pocket and the loss of the Siegfried Line, was fractured and disorganized. The Allied forces, no longer facing cohesive defensive lines, executed massive pincer movements that bypassed static garrisons and focused on annihilating the remaining pockets of resistance and seizing key industrial and transportation centers. The speed of the advance was so rapid that logistical concerns, while still present, were managed with far greater ease than in the earlier campaigns, a testament to the success of the underlying supply network. The Eastern Front, meanwhile, was experiencing a complete strategic collapse. The Soviet Red Army, having annihilated the German forces at Stalingrad and Kursk, was advancing relentlessly, fueled by a renewed sense of patriotic fervor and the immense material superiority of the Soviet industrial machine. The German forces, exhausted, undersupplied, and fighting a prolonged, brutal defensive war across vast distances, were overwhelmed by the sheer scale and intensity of the Soviet offensive. The battles for the major Eastern European capitals, Warsaw, Budapest, and ultimately Berlin, were characterized by immense destruction and catastrophic loss of life, marking the final, terminal phase of the German military effort. The final race for Berlin was a strategic and political imperative. Both the Western Allies and the Soviet Union were racing to seize the capital, driven by the immense symbolic value of capturing the heart of the Nazi regime. The Western Allied advance, though strategically vital, was deliberately slowed down in its final approach to the capital, a political decision that ceded the final, costly battle for Berlin to the Soviet Union. This final strategic positioning highlighted the political dimension of the war's conclusion, defining the eventual post-war spheres of influence. The final battles for the German heartland were fought under the immense shadow of inevitable defeat, consuming the last remnants of German professional fighting men and the tragic disposable forces of the Volkssturm. The war was now a matter of terminal arithmetic, with the collapse of the German resistance being merely a question of when, not if. The final moments of the conflict were defined by the overwhelming speed of the Allied advance and the total, irreversible consumption of the German military machine. The terminal phase of the German war effort, particularly after the loss of the Rhine bridgehead, was defined by the profound, destructive nature of Hitler's final, futile orders, directives that prioritized a delusional, fanatical defense over the preservation of the German nation and the lives of its remaining population. The legacy of the final battles for the German heartland is one of immense, unnecessary tragedy, directly attributable to the moral and strategic failure of the collapsing regime. The most infamous of these orders was the Nero Decree, formerly the Befehl betreffend Zerstörungsmaßnahmen im Reichsgebiet, issued in March 1944, which mandated the complete, systematic destruction of all remaining German infrastructure, industry, and transport facilities. This was a final, desperate, suicidal act of scorched earth, intended to deny the advancing Allied armies any usable assets. The decree highlighted the depth of the regime's moral decay, a willingness to utterly destroy the German nation rather than admit defeat. Thankfully, this order was largely ignored or sabotaged by rational field commanders and local officials, including Albert Speer, who understood the catastrophic long-term consequences of such total destruction. Despite the rational resistance to the Nero Decree, the commitment to fanatical, hold-at-all-costs defense persisted. Cities and towns were designated as fortresses, Festungen, with orders that they be defended to the last man, regardless of the immense civilian casualties and the complete military futility of the action. The battles for cities like Aachen, Cologne, and later Berlin were characterized by immense urban destruction and catastrophic loss of life, marking the final terminal phase of the German military effort. These battles served only to prolong the suffering and consume the last operational reserves of the German military. The moral failure of the regime was complete. The final defense was not fought to save Germany, but to prolong the delusional existence of a collapsing regime, sacrificing the nation's youth and infrastructure in a terminal, meaningless struggle. The final legacy of this phase is one of profound, unnecessary tragedy, a chilling testament to the dangers of fanaticism and strategic delusion. The immense sacrifice of the individual German soldier, forced to fight a battle that was logistically and materially lost, remains the final, heartbreaking cost of the collapsing regime's moral bankruptcy. The final acts of the war confirmed the ultimate strategic verdict. The German military effort was doomed not only by its logistical and industrial failures, but by the final, devastating moral failure of its command structure. The futile orders consumed the last resources, guaranteeing that the war's end was both costly and total. The final collapse of the Third Reich and the end of the war in Europe in May 1945 delivered the ultimate strategic verdict on the entire conflict, confirming the decisive role of logistics, material superiority, and command cohesion in modern warfare. The entire trajectory of the war, from the initial shock of the Blitzkrieg to the final terminal collapse, was fundamentally determined by the ability of the Allied powers to sustain, supply, and replace losses on an industrial scale that the German military could not possibly match. The core verdict was the supremacy of industrial capacity. The combined logistical output of the United States and the Soviet Union, the massive production of tanks, aircraft, fuel, and the infrastructure to move it, was the strategic weapon that broke the German Wehrmacht. The strategic breakthroughs in the West, such as the Remagen crossing, were only possible because of the logistical depth provided by the port of Antwerp and the unparalleled engineering capacity of the Allied forces. The German ambition was defeated not by a single tactical error, but by the relentless, overwhelming material reality of the opposing forces. The second verdict was the primacy of command cohesion and rationality. The Allied command structure, despite internal conflicts and strategic disagreements, maintained cohesion and ultimately made rational, large-scale decisions, such as prioritizing the Scheldt over a rapid Rhine crossing, whereas the German command structure descended into fragmentation, delusion, and destructive retribution, Hitler's final orders. The rationality of the Allied system guaranteed the effective utilization of their material superiority. The irrationality of the German system guaranteed the catastrophic consumption of their remaining resources. The third verdict was the unassailable role of logistics. The entire German war effort was starved to death by the systematic destruction of its oil plants, its rail network, and its supply lines. The failure to sustain the blitzkrieg in the east, and the subsequent collapse of the final defensive lines in the west, confirmed that a military machine, no matter how skilled its soldiers, is only as strong as its logistical tail. Logistics was not merely a support function. It was the ultimate strategic constraint that determined the final outcome of the war. The story of the final battles, the race for Berlin, and the ultimate surrender in May 1945 is the final compelling evidence of this strategic verdict. The German military machine was consumed by a war of attrition that its industrial base was incapable of sustaining. The immense courage and sacrifice of the German soldier were ultimately neutralized by the structural, insurmountable deficiencies of the military system they served. The ultimate triumph of the Allied powers was the triumph of the industrialized, logistical, and organizationally cohesive war machine, a legacy that forever cemented the principles of total war and strategic supply as the non-negotiable foundations of global conflict.